The sky was full of birds, spiraling up, up, up into a vortex, their symphony of voices showering down on us like a warm spring rain. In my passenger seat was George Archibald, the man who once danced with a crane. We had driven south from the Platte River Valley in central Nebraska, following a grid of dusty county roads, past the farms where my dad grew up, and eventually to Cottonwood waterfowl production area. This saucer-shaped wetland basin is fed by water pumped from deep underground, forming an island of life surrounded by miles of corn and beans. The combination of warm temperatures and south winds had created perfect conditions for bird migration. It was tempting to lie down in a field and watch every sandhill crane, duck, and goose in the central flyway flow over us like a river. But George and I were on a mission to find a handful of rare whooping cranes he had spotted here just a couple days before, and to have a conversation. Cranes had brought us together nearly 20 years ago, when George kindly offered to help me hatch the idea of my first book, titled On Ancient Wings, about sandhill cranes in North America. I marveled at George, co-founder of the International Crane Foundation and the preeminent crane scientist in the world, who was just as comfortable going to coffee with farmers at the corner cafe as he was at fancy dinners with heads of state. Ever the optimist and believer in people, he could talk to anyone about cranes and was very persuasive. Now he was encouraging me to consider a book, and I was reluctant. Whooping cranes are the rarest crane species. They are one of the most endangered birds in the world. What if I couldn't find any? And even if I did, how could I ever get close enough to photograph them and tell their stories? I said I'd think about it, but deep down I was afraid I'd fail. We never did see whoopers that day. A year later, back on the Platte at the Crane Trust, wildlife biologist Dave Brandt, his dog Coco, and I were sitting on the tailgate of his truck, drinking a beer and watching cranes wing back to the river at sunset. Similar to my connection with George, I'd gotten to know Dave through cranes and we had become fast friends. He was a classic field biologist, tough as nails but with a heart of gold, and he rarely shied away from telling you what he thought. "Mike, George says you're going to do a book on whooping cranes," he told me. "I think you could do it, but you better get to it." He said the science was good, but the birds needed someone to tell their story, and the window wouldn't be open forever. I said I'd think about it. Dave cracked open another beer, and our conversation drifted. A couple early mornings later, something changed. Huddled in a river blind at dawn, I looked through a hole cut in the burlap and saw a single whooping crane, bone white, among thousands of roosting sandhill cranes. And when the first rays of sun touched the horizon, she rose up like a great spirit, as if radiating light from inside, and stretched her massive wings. In that moment, my heart stopped. There was no more thinking about whether to do a book. The time had come, and I was on my way. I had seen whooping cranes on the Platte before, and those early memories came rushing back. My first time was nearly 30 years ago, hiding in a plum bush along the riverbank with then Audubon Row Sanctuary's manager Paul Tebble. As we crawled out to survey the morning roost, a bald eagle soared down the center of the river, triggering an immense liftoff of sandhill cranes. Suddenly, the Platte and its sandbars were devoid of birds, except for one, a solitary whooping crane, standing like a lighthouse in a storm, stoic and unfazed. The next time was in 2007, when a family of whooping cranes arrived on the Platte during fall migration, lingering for almost 2 weeks, a prolonged stay, but not unprecedented when a chick was in tow. What set this family apart was the large, dark stains on the birds' bellies, suggesting that at some point along their journey, they had waded or even roosted in oil. Months later, analysis of fecal and feather samples collected by biologists from the river sandbars confirmed it. Then there was the Halloween Eve when my 10-year-old daughter Elsa asked if she could trade a night of trick-or-treating for a birdwatching adventure. Shocked, I asked her where she wanted to go. "To see cranes," she exclaimed. Despite the slim chance, we drove 2 hours to the Platte, parked at a pasture gate, hiked across a meadow, and we positioned ourselves in an old elevated wooden blind. As we ate apples and PB&Js, we watched a river sunset full of ducks. Then suddenly, a family of 3 whooping cranes flew right by us at eye level and landed 100 yards upstream. I could hardly believe it. Since then, Elsa and I have gone bird watching together nearly every Halloween. Looking back over the past 4 years, I've traveled roughly 50,000 miles on what I call the Whooper Highway, an ancient north-south pathway. I feel like I'm standing in one of those clear-sighted vacuum chambers at a fair, with memories swirling around like dollar bills in a whirlwind. If you catch one, you get to keep it, but it's challenging to focus on which one to grab. I've accompanied these birds through the cycle of their seasons, meeting many people who love them. Along the way, I've amassed more than 100,000 photographs, over 70 hours of film footage, a stack of 10 coffee-stained field journals filled with scribbles and words, and an endless collection of pictures and videos on my phone. I strategically planted a dozen time-lapse cameras in critical places where whoopers reside, capturing every hour of daylight, every day, the ever-changing landscape, intimate moments, and behaviors. It has been like witnessing the earth breathe. For 3 weeks, an old buddy and I flew a flight path in his sassy red plane that traced the whooping crane's slender 2,500-mile flyway up the Great Plains, from the Texas Gulf Coast to Canada's Northwest Territories during spring migration. I hid in a blind for 8 days and nights, witnessing whooping cranes hatch chicks in one of the most remote and vast wetland wildernesses left in the world. I accompanied researchers pouring out of helicopters, hiding in fence rows, and dressing up in white-hooded crane costumes to outsmart and capture whoopers, who sometimes outsmarted their capturers. Thumbing through historic photographs, I saw whooping cranes slung over hunters' shoulders and pinned on barn walls and clotheslines during the 1800s and early 1900s, when birds were killed in large numbers for their feathers, meat, and for sport. I visited a wet spot in a northern Iowa cornfield that once cradled the last whooping crane nest in the heart of their breeding range. One spring afternoon, I stood in front of a flock of 10 whooping crane mounts at a museum, a depiction of a time when there were nearly as many whoopers in that diorama as there were in the wild. On a cold fall evening, I witnessed 130 whooping cranes coming into a prairie wetland roost with a tiny church in the background. They resembled angels descending. In a single year, I saw more than 200 individual birds, almost a quarter of their total wild and captive populations. I've seen whooping cranes do some extraordinary things, teaching a chick how to navigate a headwind in Nebraska, demonstrating patience before crossing a road to a Wisconsin cornfield, stabbing and impaling fish with dagger-sharp bills, dismembering crabs, and delicately feeding them to their chicks in the bays and salt marshes of Texas, chasing off deer and coyotes, fighting violently over breeding territories and mates, flying against the backdrop of a harvest moonrise, incubating their eggs while covered in mosquitoes and biting horseflies, standing guard while their partner sleeps, and dancing a tango that brought tears to my eyes. I've experienced their bugling unison calls in a marsh at morning and heard them warble softly to their chicks, still in their eggs. There have been some sad moments, too. When I picked up strewn feathers flecked with blood at a scene where cranes had been shot and killed. Sitting in a truck on a county road, I helplessly watched a whooping crane's amputated leg bleed. Receiving late-night texts and early morning calls from friends about a bird that struck a power line and died. I've seen people crying, laughing, yelling, and exclaiming joy for these birds. I've been one of them. And perhaps most significantly, I've had the privilege of getting to know a few individual birds and their families, spanning generations, caring for them like my family, and assigning them names. Throughout these experiences, I find myself standing humbled and grateful for the lessons from both the people and the birds who have shared these moments with me. I've learned to see the land more as the cranes do, without boundaries, straight lines, or place names. I've discovered the sobering truth that in some circles, these birds are only discussed in terms of policies and impediments to progress, a math problem, or simply data on a page. The question that I started with 4 years ago still haunts me today. Can whooping cranes survive us and our 21st century world? The answer and the power to decide rests squarely in our hands. I've also come to realize that whooping cranes, with their indomitable spirits, are more resilient than we think. As I write this from my windowed perch at our home in Lincoln, Nebraska, I can see a life-size whooping crane wood cutout crafted by my father-in-law and painted by my wife Patty a couple years ago. It presides over our small wooded backyard nestled in the heart of the city. Every day I look at her and I daydream. During migration season, our feeder attracts an array of boreal forest birds who share their summers with whooping cranes on their remote nesting grounds in Wood Buffalo National Park. Dark-eyed juncos, white-crowned sparrows, red-breasted nuthatches, thrushes, chickadees. I often chuckle, wondering what these birds think when they show up in our backyard and see a whooping crane. Then I consider what whooping cranes might think when they see us in their backyards. If they could speak, what would they say? And would we listen? Cranes are great connectors. They link habitats and people along their flyways and wherever they reside. The healthy wetland and grassland habitats essential for their survival are equally vital for our survival too. If only I could turn back time and take you by the hand through every location I've visited, sharing every detail about these extraordinary birds to make their case. Instead, I offer you this testament of pictures and words, accompanied with a prayer that it does justice to them. As you navigate through the pages, imagine the sweep of time unfolding. And perhaps you'll find the whooping crane's story entangled in your own in some meaningful way. Above all, my hope is when you hold this book in your hands, you feel something, anything, and that you will see these ancient white wonders, tallest of birds in North America and rarest of cranes in our world, as the beautiful beings they are. I'm Mike Forsberg, and these are the Whooping Crane Chronicles. This podcast is a continued effort following Into Whooperland, a book long in the making that uplifts these birds to showcase their natural history and beauty, in the hope of keeping these birds around for generations to come. Join me on the journey.